Hello YouTube, this is Froogle, and this is the first in a series of videos looking at X-Plane 10. In this first video, we're just going to do a very high-level, brief introduction to X-Plane 10, looking at what exactly it is, what its strengths are, and what its weaknesses are. What I'm not going to do in this video is compare it to Fsx. The reason for that is that nobody wins, and that's not the point of what we do. That's not the point of simulation, is to win, to be better than somebody else or something else, to compete in some way. The point of simulation, the point of flight simulation, is to enjoy the act of flying. If I were to compare X-Plane to Fsx, I would have to sit here and highlight every weak area in Fsx and point out how X-Plane is better. I would then have to reverse that and point out every weak area in X-Plane and explain how Fsx is better. Ultimately, that is a recipe for nothing more than argument. It is a recipe for comments which say my sim is better than yours, and that's not what Froogle Sim is about. Froogle Sim is about all things sim, which is why we're taking a look at X-Plane in the first place. So let's dive right in. What is X-Plane? X-Plane is a general aviation simulation tool. That sounds very pompous and highbrow, and it kind of is. What it is a simulation platform for flight simulation in particular. It was first released in 1993 and was originally written by just one guy, Austin Meyer, who felt that the market lacked a high-fidelity, accurate desktop simulation. He was studying to get his private pilot's license at the time, and he felt that the competition at that point was not suitable for assisting him in doing that. So with X-Plane, he came out with a flight simulation product which did something radically different, and that would be blade element theory. Other simulators at the time typically used lookup tables to determine how an aircraft would be simulated. So these tables were lists of numbers which determined how an aircraft would perform and respond based on the current flight conditions, the flight phase, the environmental conditions, the amount of power, and so on and so on. Blade element theory works very differently. With blade element theory, what you do is you take a model of an aircraft, you break it down into elements, very small, discrete elements, and then you decide, or you determine using physics and horrendous math, how those elements are responding to the world around them. So are they creating drag? Are they creating thrust? If they're creating drag or thrust, how does that cause an interaction between that element and the elements around it? The basic theory goes then that if you can produce a 3D model of something, then blade element theory can break it down and realistically simulate how that object moves through the air, how it performs, how it functions in the real world. To that end, X-Plane actually ships with a tool called the Plane Maker, which anybody can fire up and build a 3D object and then determine how it performs, what its flight envelope is like, how aerodynamic it is, and so on. There are limits to blade element theory, and typically if you're trying to simulate an unaerodynamic aircraft, such as a Eurofighter Typhoon, for example, then blade element theory does not do a very good job at simulating that kind of aircraft, because in the real world, aircraft like the Typhoon, like even the F-16, have complex computers on board which feed in control inputs and power inputs and adjustments throughout the phase of flight to introduce some semblance of stability to an otherwise inherently unstable airframe. The end result of all this theory is that in general, X-Plane feels like a more realistic simulation of an aircraft. At the time of this video, X-Plane remains the only 64-bit general aviation simulation platform for the desktop. Now, there's a lot of misconception about what 64-bit actually means. If you have a 64-bit application, then typically it can shift twice the amount of data as a 32-bit application per operation. So you end up with improved performance there. It also refers to the amount of addressable memory that a simulation can access. Now, Fsx is a 32-bit application, and it is limited to 3 gigabytes of memory. So even if you have a 24 gigabyte machine or a 16 gigabyte machine, Fsx can only make use of 3 gigabytes of all that memory. A 64-bit simulation, on the other hand, can in theory make use of all the memory you've got. That is the case with X-Plane. If you have 8, 16, 24, or 32, or even more gigabytes of memory, X-Plane 10 can access all that memory. That of course translates to a more realistic environment that you're flying in, more realistic graphics, more effects, more textures, and so on and so on. The other misconception about 64-bit is it typically means dual-core or multi-core support, which is something Fsx kind of has, but really wasn't developed for. With multi-core or multi-CPU support, an application should be able to identify that you're running an Intel Core i5 or an i7 or multiple Core i7s, and then spread the load among not only the cores in each individual processor, but also across different processors. That's something FSX can kinda do, but not very well. It is something that X-Plane is designed to do. A key area where that's used is in the flight model. With an X-Plane, the flight model exists on its own thread. That thread is typically placed on its own CPU core or even on its own CPU. If you have other aircraft in the environment that you're flying in, maybe they're AI aircraft, or more likely they are real aircraft and you're online with VATSIM or IVAO, each aircraft can get its own CPU core. What this means in real terms is that when you finally go online and you end up with 10 other aircraft around you at the airport you're parked at, you don't suffer a frame rate hit. If you currently did that in FSX and you fire up Squawk Box or FSIN at a very busy airport, you will find that your frame rate dips because that single core that's being used to run everything suddenly has to do a whole lot more work. Because X-Plane is also a modern simulator, it can make use of modern hardware in other ways as well. X-Plane is more than capable of really pushing a very high-end video card to its limits, again resulting in dramatic visual effects, environmental effects, and all sorts of wonderful graphical goodies. Now, as a general aviation simulation, X-Plane 10 does simulate the entire planet. X-Plane is supplied on 8 DVDs, which when installed, if you installed them all, comes to about 70 or 80 gigabytes of data. You don't need to install them all. You can get away with just installing the areas that you want to fly in. If you do install them all, though, you end up with a very, very accurate topographical and orthographic view of the entire planet from 74 degrees north to 60 degrees south, covering more than 33,000 airports, as well as, of course, the classic aircraft carriers, oil rigs, frigates, and so on and so on. Now, this is one area actually where X-Plane falls down and is strongly criticized. Although it has 33,000 airports, very few of them actually have any buildings attached to the airport, which means that quite often you'll fly into an airport and you'll see just a barren wasteland with some taxiways and runways, and that's it. The good news is that that's changing. As well as shipping with a plane maker, X-Plane also ships with something called the World Editor, or WED. What the World Editor does is it allows anybody with basic keyboard and mouse skills to use predefined, almost building block buildings and drop them in place to build an airport. As a result, there is a massive community of free and freely available scenery out there, which covers vast parts of the world. In recording this video, I did some flying obviously around my home in Orlando and around Florida. I picked up something called Destination Florida and another library it uses called OpenX, and suddenly that populated all of the Florida airports that I use, and they look pretty accurate. And that's completely free. If an airport you use does not have scenery freely available, then it doesn't take a great deal of effort to build it yourself. I know that's not very appealing if you're coming from an environment where the airport's already provided for you, or if you're in that mindset of going to a website and just, I want to buy a very highly detailed airport, download it and install it. That still applies in X-Plane. You can still go to Aerosoft, you can still go to xplane.org and places like that and buy pre-built scenery, very high definition scenery and very highly accurate scenery as well. But if you don't want to spend the money, the key here is that out of the box, X-Plane has all the tools you need to build what you need, and also has an extensive library online that you can just go and get stuff from for free. In terms of the world scenery and the environment that you fly in, another big complaint leveled at X-Plane is it's not photorealistic, and it's not. What X-Plane does is it tries to create a plausible world. So if you're flying over Orlando or Seattle or Denver or Washington or London, then oftentimes it won't look like the London or Washington or Seattle that you're familiar with. X-Plane instead tries to create a plausible environment. So using the data it has from its world maps, it identifies what is a small town, what is a large town, and then it does, I guess, the equivalent of FSX's autogen to populate those towns with appropriate buildings based on the size of the town, population density, and stuff like that. The end result is that you do have a plausible environment, but not an incredibly photorealistic one. To some people, this is a big deal. If they're flying over Paris, they want to see the Eiffel Tower. If they're flying over Seattle, they want to see the Space Needle. And the fact that those things don't exist can be a big letdown. Outside of that, though, the scenery and the environment within X-Plane is absolutely stunning. Really stunning. The level of detail that you get in every area on the planet is breathtaking. with trees populating forest, and these are accurate 3D models of trees as well. They're not simply flat textures overlaid on a 3D mesh. They are real trees that stand up from the ground that you can, if you're in a helicopter, you can get down low and take a look at. You have winding rivers with water that ripples and foams and builds up and reflects the scenery around it. You have mountains and valleys and canyons, which all look highly realistic and highly plausible. In addition, the weather system in X-Plane is often targeted as a big weak area, and it is. There is a system in X-Plane to let you set global weather, so you can set weather conditions once which apply to the entire planet. There is also a system for downloading real-world weather, and it's okay, it does a pretty good job, but it's not Active Sky, it's not Rex, or anything like that. However, the big benefit of the weather system and the weather representation in X-Plane is that it's real. So if you're flying into a cloud, that cloud is a 3D object, and it is a dynamic 3D object that is moving in the sky based on the wind conditions around it. It might change shape based on the current environmental conditions around it. As you fly into it, your view out of the cockpit will gradually change, as opposed to rapidly, completely shift from one state to another. The weather system is also scalable. What that means is that if you fly into an area which suddenly has very, very dramatic weather patterns in place, the system will scale in such a way that you still see all that weather without a noticeable impact on the performance of the sim. There is obviously a difference in performance between flying with no weather and flying with a lot of weather, so a lot of clouds, a lot of precipitation and stuff like that. Obviously there's a difference there, but the difference between light clouds, scattered clouds, and heavy overcast thunderstorms with rain is minimal. Another weak area of X-Plane is the user interface. A lot of people get quite concerned that the user interface looks quite old, it looks unpolished, it's clunky, and it is, it really, really is. And Laminar, the developers of X-Plane, are aware of that, and they've had a lot of requests from the community to get it changed, to get a designer on board to make it look pretty. Ultimately though, the user interface is not something that you mess with too much. You tend to use the user interface to set up your flight or to reset your flight if something goes wrong. Outside of that, you're in an aircraft and flying the aircraft. You shouldn't really need to mess with the UI, but if the UI is a big sticking point for you, then X-Plane might not be for you. In the cockpit, X-Plane ships with more than 30 built-in aircraft. Now, some of these aircraft are legacy aircraft from previous versions of X-Plane, and so they're a little weak graphically, or very weak graphically. Many of them, however, are not. There are many aircraft built into X-Plane 10 now, supplied by third-party developers. For example, one developer, Jay Rollon, who produces extremely high-quality aircraft for X-Plane, he has an aircraft in the sim out of the box. Similarly, Camsin, who produced recently the phenomenal B-25 Mitchell for X-Plane, they have scenery added into X-Plane, such as the aircraft carrier that you see, the oil rigs that you see. They're developed by Camsin. The overriding problem usually with default aircraft in a simulation is the development team was trying to build a sim. So by adding aircraft in, the aircraft become generalized. They become not very specific, not very accurate. By using third-party developers to hand over free aircraft, in effect, to add into the default sim, you actually get some pretty good representations of the aircraft. The Cessna, for example, out of the box, is very accurate indeed. Within the cockpit, most of the default aircraft and all of the aircraft that you're going to buy on the open market or even download from the free sources have working 3D cockpits. They also have a really cool camera system, which is very much like EasyDock in FSX. What I tend to do on my videos for FSX is I set up EasyDock presets, which means I can press one key on my keyboard and I can very quickly shift the view, say from the cockpit down to the instrument panel or down to the CDU in a complex jet. The same thing is actually built into X-Plane, and it's very easy to use. Within any view, you can shift that view by zooming in, by translating it sideways, up, down, forwards, backwards. You can do that in any view you like. And when you have the camera positioned where you want it to be, simply hold down Control and press a key on the number pad. That assigns that key on the number pad to be that view. From that point on, you can simply hit the keys on the number pad to dynamically shift between the different views that you've set up, just like EasyDock, and it's included in X-Plane out of the box. Now, X-Plane has been around for quite some time. It was first launched in 1993, so given that legacy, anybody looking at picking it up today has got to ask, how much is it going to cost me to get this thing working the way I want it to work? To be fair, out of the box, X-Plane has very weak areas, such as lacking scenery around airports, such as the plausible dynamic world. To fix those things, as I said earlier in this video, I downloaded free scenery for Florida and a free library of scenery called OpenX, installed those in about 10 minutes, no cost to me there. I also had handed to me for review something called Urban Max. What Urban Max does is it increases the plausible scenery generation and makes it even more realistic. It's still not photorealistic, London still doesn't look entirely like London, but you do get more populated areas now. It does create a much more realistic looking environment out of the window. And to be honest, at flight level 310, nobody cares that the Eiffel Tower is not underneath you, or that the street you're flying over isn't actually the correctly named street. What they care about is, does it look real? And Urban Max plus the plausible dynamic scenery and X-Plane does a fantastic job there. Urban Max, incidentally, is $7.95. For the weather, while I like the weather modeling in X-Plane greatly, and I think it's very realistic, it can be better. There's a product coming from the same guys that did Urban Max called SkyMax. It's not currently out yet, but the guys did send me a copy to review. SkyMax has been used in all the video that you've seen running throughout this, and it's used to generate even better, more detailed volumetric fog, clouds, cloud movement, cloud patterns. It also changes the coloring of the sim. This is a concern a lot of people have had in the past with X-Plane 10, is the colors can look somewhat subdued. SkyMax can change that and put in place color themes, kind of like the graphical themes that you might pick up from Shade or from Rex for Fsx. Now I'm going to be doing a lot more videos, short videos like this, covering each area of X-Plane. So looking at the weather, looking at the scenery, looking at the flight model and stuff like that. But before we get into those, the golden question I think a lot of you are going to have is, why should I care? Now this is where we're not going to get into a comparison, as I said, with Fsx, but most of you are Fsx users, and you're asking, why the hell should I care? Why is Froogle suddenly getting so excited about X-Plane? The reasons for that are numerous. As I said, X-Plane is the first and currently only general aviation simulation that is 64-bit for the desktop. This means that if you have a modern PC, and a lot of us do, we've tried to really boost our PC's performance in order to make up for the deficiencies of Fsx. That means you have a PC ideally suited to X-Plane. A PC that can run at 30, 40, 50 or 100 frames per second in X-Plane with highly detailed graphics, very high resolution textures, very cool looking dynamic scenery, dynamic weather, dynamic cloud patterns, and all those things are very, very exciting. X-Plane 10 is the simulator designed for your current hardware. The other reason to get somewhat excited, or at least to pay attention, is that Fsx is dying. It is an unsupported platform. Lockheed have the license to ESP, which is the foundation of Fsx, and they are extending it and building on it, and Prepared is looking very nice indeed. And Prepared 2 has a lot of features that X-Plane has had for some time now, such as volumetric clouds and fog, and it's looking very, very attractive. But regardless, Fsx is an unsupported and dying platform. X-Plane, however, is not. It has an incredibly active community, providing terabytes of free downloads for aircraft, for scenery, for weather adjustments, for add-on scripts, for extensions, for enhancements. It is actively supported, it is actively developed, it is growing, and it is designed for what we currently have today. Beyond all of that though, my interest in flight simulation is flying. My interest in flight simulation is the feeling of flight, the dynamicity of moving through the air and seeing how the aircraft responds to shifts in the air current and my control inputs. X-Plane is without doubt the single most realistic flight simulation platform you can get in your home today. No question about that. There have been great strides in Fsx from some of the add-on manufacturers like Majestic, like PMDG, producing external flight models which improve and supersede the flight models that are built into Fsx. But this stuff is standard in X-Plane and it always has been. It is simply a better, more realistic environment to fly in. Anyway, that's it for this very high-level overview of X-Plane 10. Let me know in the comment section below what you think, and please try to avoid getting into back and forth my sim is better than your sim arguments. Let's try to talk about this as adults. It's not a I'm better than you kind of thing. It's not a Call of Duty versus Battlefield, which one is best kind of argument or discussion. It's simply a discussion about simulation. Thanks for watching. As always, my name is Froogle. See you soon.